Her father's debts cleared the morning she left, and she did not look back at the house when the wagon pulled away from the yard. She had sold what she could. The iron cook stove, the parlor chairs her mother had brought from Ontario, 2 quilts, a butter churn, and a cedar chest that still smelled faintly of lavender, what remained fit in a single trunk, and even that felt like more than she deserved to carry. The arrangement had been made through a letter. A man in the Northwest Territories, a homestead outside a settlement called Edson Crossing, which she had to look up on a map and find with her finger, pressed to a crease in the paper where the prairies went flat and pale and endless. He had written that he needed someone capable, not pretty, not young, capable. She had read the word 3 times and decided it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She took the train from Winnipeg. It was 2 days, not 7 hours. Anyone who said otherwise had never ridden the Canadian Pacific through the Shield and out the other side into the open country where the sky became something you had to reckon with, not just look at. She watched it from the window. The rock and the spruce gave way to something broader. The horizon flattened, the light changed, went longer, lay across the grass in a way that made everything look like it was just finishing or just beginning. She did not sleep much. She ate the bread she had packed and drank water from a tin cup and watched the country go past and tried not to think about what she was going toward. It was easier to think about what she was leaving. Not her father, who was gone 3 months now. Not the house, which had never really felt like hers, just the river she used to walk along in the evenings, and the way the ice went out in April with a sound like the whole world shifting. She would not have that anymore. The man meeting her at the station in Edson Crossing was not what she had pictured. She had not pictured much, but still. He was older than she expected. Not old, but worn in the way that land wears people, around the eyes, in the set of the shoulders. He was standing beside a wagon and a gray mare who looked like she had opinions about standing still. And he had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it by the brim slowly, like he was winding something up or letting it down. He said her name when he saw her come off the platform with her trunk. He said it the way you say a name you have written down and are finally reading aloud for the first time. She said yes, that was all. She handed him one end of the trunk. They loaded it together without speaking, and she climbed up onto the seat herself before he had a chance to offer a hand, and she noticed that, and then they were moving. The road north was 2 ruts in the grass. The mare knew it without much direction. The man said the settlement was 20 minutes back and the homestead was 45 minutes further, and she said that was fine. He said the house was small. She said she had seen small houses. He said the winter had been hard on the outbuildings. She nodded once and turned to look at the country going past on both sides, and he did not say anything else for a while, and she was glad. She had been around men who talked to fill silence because silence made them nervous. This one seemed to understand that silence was just another kind of weather. You moved through it. You did not fight it. The homestead came into view around a low rise. She saw it before he said anything. A cabin, squared logs, a sod roof that had greened up with the spring and now sagged on one side like a tired question. A barn that leaned slightly east. A chicken coop that had lost its door somewhere, and the boards around the opening were splintered and gray. There was a garden plot that had been attempted. She could see the furrows, but something had gone wrong with it, either the planting or the season or both. The fence posts around the yard were sound. She noticed that first. The posts were straight and the wire was tight. Someone had cared about the fence. She looked at the cabin again, then at the coop, then at the barn. He said the chickens were the main concern right now. He said he had 8 hens and a rooster, and they were laying but not how they should be, and if she could manage that, the chickens and the garden and cooking, he would handle the rest. She said, "What's the rest?" He said the cattle, the grain, the wood, the maintenance of the outbuildings. She looked at the outbuildings. She did not say what she was thinking. What she was thinking was that the maintenance of the outbuildings had not been attended to in some time, and that the coop with no door was probably why the hens were not laying how they should be. Because a hen with no door between herself and the dark has a different kind of sleep than a hen who is closed and safe. She knew that. She had kept chickens since she was 9 years old. She said, "All right." They went inside. The cabin had one room divided by a curtain hung on a length of twine. A wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with flour and salt and a tin of lard and not much else. A rope bed on his side of the curtain, a cot on hers. The cot had a wool blanket folded at the foot of it, and the blanket looked clean, and she appreciated that more than she could have said. She unpacked her trunk that evening while he went to see to the cattle. She put her things away in the space she had. There was not much space, so it did not take long. She had a photograph of her mother she set on the windowsill, facing the glass so the light would come through it in the morning. She had a small knife she put in her pocket. She had a book she set on the floor beside the cot because there was no shelf. When he came back in, she had supper on. Salt pork and dried beans and biscuits from the flour on the shelf. It was not much, but it was warm and it was on time. He sat down and ate and said it was good. She said, "Thank you." That was the first day. The coop got a door on the 3rd day. She built it herself from boards she found stacked behind the barn, gray and weathered but sound. She measured with her hand and her eye and cut with a saw she found hanging on a nail. He came past while she was fitting the hinges and he stood for a moment and watched and did not say anything. She did not look up. When she was done, she opened the door and closed it, and the hens inside shuffled and settled. That night, 2 of them laid. She did not mention this to him. She just put the eggs on the shelf. The garden was harder. The soil here was different than what she had known in Manitoba. Heavier, darker, richer in some ways. But it had gone hard at the surface from the rain that had come, and then stopped, and then come again, all in the wrong order. She worked it with a fork for 2 mornings before she found the rhythm of it. She turned it in rows. She planted what she had brought in a paper packet in her trunk. Carrots, turnips, a handful of dried beans she had saved from the previous year, some onion sets she had wrapped in cloth. She planted them and covered them and pressed the soil down with the flat of her hand. She did not know if they would take. She did not say that to anyone. She just planted them. The woman who ran the small store at Edson Crossing was named Mrs. Fenwick, and she was the first person to speak to her at any length since she had arrived. She came in with the wagon on a Wednesday in late June, and Mrs. Fenwick was behind the counter, and she looked at her the way people look at someone they have been wondering about. She asked how she was settling in. She said, "Well enough." Mrs. Fenwick said the homestead had been going badly for a while. She said the man had come out from Quebec 6 years ago, which explained a few things if she knew the type, and she said it without unkindness, the way people who have lived long in a place speak about the things that simply are. He worked hard. He did not ask for help. He had got himself into trouble in the winter before last with a burst pipe and had lost the root vegetables and half the grain, and he had sold the cattle down to 5 to cover it. He had not recovered yet. She listened. Mrs. Fenwick said, "You are the second one." She did not ask what had happened to the first. She thought she might already know, or that it was not her business to know, or both. She bought what she could afford and went back to the wagon and drove back along the ruts in the grass, and the mare knew the way, so she did not have to think about the road. She thought about the burst pipe. She thought about root vegetables and grain and cattle down to 5. She thought about the fence posts, straight and tight-wired, that someone had taken time to get right while everything else was falling. That evening she asked him about the root cellar. He said it was there, pointing, and she asked to see it. He took her out to the low mound behind the cabin and opened the door, and they went down the steps together into the dark and the smell of cold earth. She waited until her eyes adjusted. The shelves were bare. The walls were sound except for one place where the frost had pushed through and left a crack along the bottom course of stones. She said she would need to re-chink that before September. He looked at where she was pointing and said he had meant to get to it. She said she could do it herself if he had lime. He said there was some left in the barn. She said good. They came back up into the light, and he squinted against it and looked at her in a way she had not quite seen from him before. Not surprised, exactly. More like a man recalculating something in his head and finding the numbers different than he had put down. She went back to the cabin to start supper. July came and the garden came with it. Not everything. The onion sets had gone slow and the carrots were thin, but the beans were up and the turnips were doing something real, making leaves that were wide and dark and pointed the right direction. She weeded in the mornings before the heat set in. She brought water from the well in a bucket and walked the rows and poured it slow. She noticed he watched the garden sometimes from the barn door without coming over to look, and she understood that to mean something without being sure what. She re-chinked the root cellar herself, over 3 afternoons, mixing the lime with sand and water in a bucket and pressing it into the crack with her hands until it was smooth. He came by once and asked if she needed help, and she said not right now, and he went back to what he was doing. The work was not difficult. It was just slow, and patience with slow work was something she had learned from her mother, who had grown up on a farm outside Guelph and believed that most things worth doing took longer than you thought, and you might as well accept that from the start. She accepted it. The hens were laying well by midsummer. All 8 of them, most days, and occasionally something extra from the gray one who she had come to think of as a dedicated hen. She gathered the eggs each morning and put them in the basket she had found hanging in the barn, and she began selling the surplus to Miss Fenwick, who took them gladly and paid in credit at the store. She did not tell him immediately. She had thought about whether to tell him and decided to wait until she had something to say. When she had 3 months of credit built up, she told him at supper. He put down his fork. She said she had been selling the surplus eggs to the store in the settlement. She said she had credit enough to buy the seed for next year's garden and still have something left toward whatever else was needed. He said, "Whose account?" She said hers. She said she would put it toward the household if he wanted. She said she figured it was household, the eggs being from his hens and her labor in equal measure. He sat with that for a moment. He said he had not thought about the eggs as having a value beyond their use. She said most things had a value beyond their immediate use if you thought about them long enough. He looked at her across the table. He said he was starting to think that was true. The first frost came early that year, the 3rd week of September, and she had watched for it and was ready. She brought in the turnips the day before, reading the sky the way her mother had taught her, the way the clouds sat low and flat in the north, and the air lost its autumn smell and went clean and cold. She pulled the turnips and carried them down to the root cellar herself, load by load, and set them on the shelves in rows. She brought the remaining beans. She brought the carrots, thin as they were. She covered the onions with straw. He came in from the fields that evening, and she had a pot of soup going with the first of the turnips and some salt pork. And he stood at the door and looked at her and at the pot and at the window where the frost had started to come in at the edges of the glass. He said he had not expected her to be ahead of it. She said she had been watching the weather for 3 weeks. He said he could see that. He hung his coat and sat down, and she put the soup on the table, and they ate without talking for a while. And outside the wind had started to move through the grass with a sound like something being swept away. She listened to it. Cabin held. The stove threw good heat. The root cellar below the mound behind the house was full for the first time in at least 2 years, according to what Mrs. Fenwick had told her, and she sat with that. After supper, he said he appreciated her. He said it plainly, without looking up from his cup, and she understood that it was not easy for him to say, and that it was real because of it. She said thank you. She meant it. The winter was hard. They had all been told it would be, and it was, but hard in the particular way of the Northwest, where the cold came down from the north with a seriousness about it, like it had somewhere to be and was going through you to get there. The temperature in January dropped to 40 below on 3 separate days, and on those days neither of them went further than the woodpile and the barn. She had put up enough wood. She had started bringing it in from the yard in November, stacking it along the inner wall of the cabin, until he said there was almost no room to move, and she said she would rather have no room to move than be short of wood in February. He did not argue with her on that. She kept the stove through the night. She learned his patterns of sleeping, and woke when the fire needed tending without disturbing him. She lay in her cot on her side of the curtain, and listened to the cold working at the cabin walls, and thought it was not so different from what she had known in Manitoba. Except here there was less town and more sky, and she had come to prefer that. She thought sometimes about the river at home, the way it had sounded in April when the ice went out. She thought she would find another river in the spring. There was one she had crossed on the road north that had willows along it, and a particular bend where the water slowed. She thought she would walk to it when the snow was gone. In February, she started seeds on the windowsill in tin cans she saved from the store. Tomatoes, which she had not tried the previous year, and some cabbage. The light was not enough yet, but it was coming back a little each day, and she tilted the cans to follow it, moving them each morning. And by March, the seedlings were leggy but alive. He watched her do this. He watched from his chair by the stove, reading or mending harness or doing the accounts in the ledger he kept in the drawer of the table. She could feel his attention without him making anything of it. It was not uncomfortable. It was more like being observed by someone who was trying to understand something carefully. One evening in late March, he said, "You know what you're doing." She looked up from the seedlings. He said it again, quieter. He said he had thought he understood what he was asking for when he wrote the letter, and he had been wrong about it. She said, what had he thought he was asking for? He said someone to manage the house and the chickens, to keep things from going worse, she said, and now, he said. Now he thought he had been asking without knowing what he was asking, and that she had understood it better than he had, and that the place looked different than it had looked in a long time. She looked at the seedlings in their tins. She looked at the window, which still had frost along the upper edge. She looked at the curtain on the twine, and the stove throwing its heat, and the ledger open on the table, and the barn outside where the cattle were wintered, and the 8 hens in the coop with its proper door. She said she thought the place had good bones. He said his mother used to say that about houses. She said hers, too. They sat with that for a while. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, the kind of dropping you could feel before you heard it, the cold getting into the seams of things. But inside, the stove was even, and the light was the same light it had been for months, and she did not feel the need to say anything else, and neither did he, and that felt, to her, like something she had not expected to find. Not contentment exactly. Not yet. Something more like the first sign of it, a thing that could grow into that if they let it. She turned back to the seedlings. She moved the tin nearest the glass, angling it toward the window. Outside, the snow was still there, but it had that quality it gets in the last of winter, heavy and blue in the shadows, a little soft at the surface on the south-facing slopes. She knew that quality. It meant the season was deciding. She was patient. She could wait.